Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. I found a hidden basement in the woods and played Ouija board. Someone opened the door. You ever have one of those days where everything feels off? Not in a paranormal way, just off. Like you forgot something important but can't quite figure out what it is. That's how my day started when I found the basement. I guess it started long before that. But the basement is where everything really began to unravel. It was late October, and the air had that crisp, almost metallic bite that makes you think of bonfires and horror movies. I was hiking through the woods behind my house. Nothing unusual, just killing time. I live in a small town, the kind where the most exciting thing to do is grab a drink at the same bar your dad used to hang out in. So, yeah, the woods were kind of my escape. Anyway, I'd been walking for about an hour when I noticed something strange. There was this old stone structure, half covered by moss and leaves. It looked like the foundation of a house that had long since crumbled away. Now, I'd been through these woods more times than I could count, but I had never seen this before. Curious, I pushed aside some overgrown branches and got a closer look. It wasn't a house foundation, as I first thought. It was a staircase, a stone staircase leading down into the ground. At first, I figured it was some kind of old root cellar, maybe part of a farmstead from the 1800s. My town's got a lot of history like that, but the more I stared at it, the weirder it seemed. The entrance was almost perfectly hidden, like someone had gone out of their way to keep it concealed. Now, any sane person would probably have just turned around and headed home, but not me. I don't know if it was the cold air or the sheer weirdness of finding something like that, but I felt like I had to see where it led. Maybe I'm just naturally curious, or maybe I'd watched too many horror movies to know better. But I found myself descending those stone steps. The air got colder as I went down, and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees faded away. There was an eerie silence, the kind that presses in on your ears, making you feel like you're sinking into the earth itself. The steps were slick with moisture, and I had to move carefully to avoid slipping. I kept expecting the stairs to end at some point, but they just kept going. It was a good 50 steps down before I finally reached the bottom. There was a heavy wooden door at the base of the stairs, weathered and swollen from years of exposure to the damp underground. A large, rusted iron ring served as the handle. The whole setup was straight out of a horror movie, but it didn't feel like one. Not yet, anyway. I figured it was some old storage space, maybe abandoned decades ago. Still, the sense of unease was growing. That creeping feeling that something was just not right. I hesitated for a moment before grabbing the iron ring and giving it a tug. The door groaned on its hinges, but didn't budge. I pulled harder, putting my weight into it, and finally, with a shriek of metal on stone, the door swung open. The smell hit me first. A damp, earthy smell, mixed with something I couldn't quite place. It was like the air had been trapped down there for centuries. Stale and heavy. Beyond the door was a small room, about 10 feet by 10 feet, with stone walls and a dirt floor. The only light came from the open doorway behind me, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. In the center of the room was a small wooden table, and on that table was an old, worn Ouija board. I'm not one to mess around with stuff like that. Sure, I've played with a Ouija board at parties, but it was always just a joke, a way to freak people out. But this was different. The board looked ancient, the letters and numbers barely visible beneath a layer of dust and grime. There was something unsettling about it, like it had been waiting for someone to find it. I should have left right then and there. I should have turned around, closed the door, and walked back up those stairs. But I didn't. I was curious. Maybe too curious for my own good. I stepped into the room, feeling the cold dirt crunch beneath my boots, and approached the table. There was no planchette, just the board sitting there, lonely and forgotten. I stood there for a moment, staring down at it, my mind racing. Why was it here? Who put it here? And why did I feel this overwhelming urge to touch it? Before I could think it through, I reached out and brushed the dust off the board. The wood was rough and splintered beneath my fingers, and as I cleared away the grime, the letters became more distinct, almost like they were glowing in the dim light. I didn't say anything, didn't ask any questions. I just stood there, my hand resting on the board, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, without warning, the door slammed shut behind me. I nearly jumped out of my skin, spinning around to face the door. My breath caught in my throat as I realized I was now trapped in this underground room, the only light coming from a thin gap around the edges of the door. I rushed over, yanking on the iron ring, but the door wouldn't budge. It was like something on the other side was holding it shut. Panic started to set in, and I pounded on the door, shouting for help. But all I got in response was the echo of my own voice. I was alone in a hidden basement with an ancient Ouija board. And then, in the darkness behind me, I heard it, a slow, deliberate creak, like wood straining under pressure. I turned around, my eyes straining to see in the dim light, and that's when I noticed it. The Ouija board was moving. The planchette that wasn't there before now sat on the board, inching its way across the letters. My blood ran cold as I watched it spell out a single word, one letter at a time. O-P-E-N. The room was silent. Too silent. My breath sounded unnaturally loud in the still air, each inhale and exhale echoing off the stone walls like a reminder that I was very much alive. The only other sound was the soft scraping of the planchette as it moved across the Ouija board, as if guided by some unseen hand. O-P-E-N. That word hung in the air, heavier than the darkness pressing in on me. My first thought was to deny it, to tell myself that I was imagining things, that it had to be some trick of the mind. But deep down, I knew better. I could feel it. Something in that room wanted me to open the door. I backed away from the table, trying to keep my distance from the board, my eyes locked on the planchette as if it might move again. But it didn't. It just sat there, perfectly still in the middle of the board, as if waiting. I had to get out. That much was clear. Whatever was down here, whatever had moved that planchette, it wasn't something I wanted to meet. I turned back to the door, gripping the iron ring with both hands and pulling with all my strength. The wood groaned, but it held fast, refusing to give way. Panic started to bubble up inside me again, that cold, paralyzing fear that tells you something is very, very wrong. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. There had to be another way out, some other exit I hadn't seen. I began to feel along the walls, searching for any sign of a hidden door or passage. The stone was rough and cold under my fingers, slick with moisture, but it was solid, too solid. I was trapped. Just as I was about to give up, I heard it again, the creak of wood, this time louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the door or the table. It was coming from the ceiling. I looked up, squinting into the darkness. At first, I couldn't see anything, just the rough stone above me. But then I noticed something, a thin, barely visible line running across the ceiling, like the outline of a hatch or trapdoor. The creaking continued, the sound of wood shifting under some kind of pressure. My heart skipped a beat as I realized what it was. Someone, or something, was opening the hatch. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet as I moved away from the center of the room. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was it an animal? A person? I didn't know which was worse. But whatever it was, I had a sinking feeling that it wasn't something I wanted to meet. The hatch continued to open, slowly, agonizingly slowly. And then, with a final groan, it stopped. I held my breath, straining to see what was up there. But the darkness was too thick. I could only make out a vague shape, something large and heavy hovering just beyond the edge of the hatch. For a moment, nothing happened. The room was so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. And then, with a soft thud, something fell from the hatch. landing on the dirt floor with a dull, wet sound. I froze, my eyes fixed on the object lying on the ground. It was small, about the size of a football, and covered in a dark, glistening substance. My stomach turned as the smell hit me. Coppery, metallic, unmistakably the scent of blood. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there staring at the thing on the ground. But my body wouldn't cooperate. I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the horror in front of me. And then it moved. The thing twitched, a slow, jerky motion, and I realized with a sickening lurch that it wasn't just an object. It was a head, a human head, severed cleanly at the neck, with matted hair and lifeless, staring eyes. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and there was a deep gash across the forehead, exposing bone. I gagged, my stomach churning with a mix of fear and revulsion. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of sick joke, a prop or a hallucination brought on by the stress of being trapped down here. But the smell, the blood, the weight of the air around me told me otherwise. This was real, too real. The head twitched again, the eyes rolling in their sockets until they locked onto me. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest, and that's when I saw it, an inscription on the dirt floor, right beneath where the head had fallen. It was faint, scratched into the ground with something sharp, but I could make out the letters clearly enough. Help me. The message wasn't for me, I realized. It was from whoever, or whatever, had left the head. They were trapped too, or had been, and now I was the next one in line. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted for the door, yanking on the iron ring with all the strength I could muster. The door remained stubbornly closed, the wooden metal refusing to give an inch. My hands were trembling, slick with sweat, but I kept pulling, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. The planchette was sliding across the Ouija board again, faster this time, as if driven by some desperate force. It spelled out two more words, clear and unmistakable, DONTLEAVE. I ignored it, my focus solely on getting out of this hellhole. But as I pulled, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A faint, whispering voice coming from somewhere behind me. It was soft, almost too soft to hear, but the words were clear. Stay with me. I whipped around, searching the room for the source of the voice, but there was no one there. Just the head on the ground, the Ouija board, and the dark, oppressive silence. The whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent, until it was all I could hear. Stay with me, forever. I backed up against the door, my heart racing, and the voice grew louder still, filling the room, echoing off the walls, drowning out everything else. It wasn't just one voice anymore, it was many. A chorus of whispering, pleading voices, all saying the same thing. Stay, stay, stay. I couldn't take it anymore. I covered my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it didn't help. The voices were inside my head, crawling into my mind, wrapping around my thoughts like vines. I squeezed my eyes shut, shaking my head, trying to resist, but it was no use. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The room fell silent once more, the oppressive weight of the air lifting slightly. I opened my eyes, half expecting to see something horrible standing in front of me, but there was nothing. Just the same cold, dark room, the Ouija board, and the head on the ground. But something was different. The door, it was open, just a crack, but enough to see the faint light from the staircase beyond. My heart leapt in my chest, a surge of hope flooding through me. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed the door and yanked it open, the hinges screeching in protest, and stumbled out into the narrow stairway. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if anything was following me. I just ran, taking the steps two at a time, my legs burning, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The cold air hit me like a shock as I burst out into the open, the sunlight blinding after the darkness of the basement. But I was free, or at least I thought I was. As I reached the edge of the woods, gasping for breath, I heard it again, the whispering, faint and distant. but unmistakable. It was coming from the direction of the basement, carried on the wind like a ghostly echo. Stay with me. I didn't stop running until I was back home, locking every door and window behind me. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had brought something back with me, something that wasn't going to let me go that easily. And that's when I realized this wasn't over, not by a long shot. I wish I could say that running out of those woods was the end of it, but it wasn't, not even close. When I got home that day, I was rattled, sure, but I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the fear had played tricks on me. Maybe the head was just a gruesome prank, some sick joke left behind by a twisted mind. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Something had followed me home, and it wasn't just my paranoia. That night, I didn't sleep. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I could see that head, the lifeless eyes staring back at me, and the whispers, those whispers that had crawled into my skull and taken root. The house felt different too. Colder, darker, like the shadows were stretching just a bit too far, lingering in the corners of every room. I tried to distract myself. I turned on every light in the house, cranked up the TV, even blasted music through my headphones. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was like something was watching me, just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. By the time midnight rolled around, I was exhausted, but sleep was the last thing on my mind. I was too afraid to close my eyes. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall, my mind racing. That's when I heard it, a soft creak, like a floorboard bending under someone's weight. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing up. The sound came again, this time closer, just outside my bedroom door. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to hear any other noises, but the house was silent. I slowly got up, my movements careful and deliberate, trying not to make a sound. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew what was happening. Something was in the house with me. I moved to the door, pressing my ear against the wood, holding my breath. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the pounding of my own heart. And then, ever so faintly, I heard it. Stay with me. The whisper was so quiet that I almost convinced myself I had imagined it, but I knew better. The voice was the same as the one from the basement, soft and pleading, like it was begging me to listen. My skin crawled, every instinct screaming at me to run, to get out of the house. But where would I go? It wasn't like I could just leave and pretend this wasn't happening. Gathering every ounce of courage I had left, I turned the knob and slowly opened the door. The hallway beyond was dark, the only light coming from the bathroom at the far end. I stepped out, my bare feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. The air was cold, colder than it should have been, like the warmth had been sucked out of the house. As I made my way down the hall, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something standing there, but the hallway was empty. I reached the bathroom and flicked on the light, hoping the bright fluorescence would chase away whatever shadows were creeping into my mind. But the light didn't help. If anything, it made things worse. In the mirror above the sink, I saw something that made my blood run cold. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, some optical illusion caused by my frazzled nerves. But as I stared, I realized it was all too real. There was a figure standing behind me, just out of focus, barely visible in the reflection. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly limbs and a face that I couldn't quite make out, like it was shrouded in darkness. But its eyes were clear as day, pale, milky white, and fixed on me with a hunger that made my stomach twist. I spun around, ready to bolt, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty, just as it had been before. But when I looked back at the mirror, the figure was still there, closer now, those white eyes staring at me from just over my shoulder. I backed out of the bathroom, my legs trembling so badly that I almost fell. The figure didn't move, but its presence filled the room, pressing in on me, suffocating me with its cold, unblinking gaze. I had to get out. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I grabbed my phone off the kitchen counter and bolted for the front door. not even bothering to put on shoes. My hands shook as I fumbled with the lock, my breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. Finally, I got the door open and stumbled out into the night. The cool air hitting my face like a splash of water. I ran to my car, the gravel driveway crunching under my feet. As I yanked the door open, I couldn't resist one last glance back at the house. For a moment, everything seemed normal. The porch light glowing softly, the curtains gently swaying in the breeze. But then, I saw it. The figure from the mirror, standing in the front window, its pale eyes fixed on me, even from a distance. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I jumped into the car, slammed the door shut, and tore out of the driveway, the tires skidding on the gravel. My mind was a blur, racing with 1,000 thoughts. But one thing was clear. I had to get as far away from that house as possible. I drove aimlessly for hours, through dark, winding country roads, past fields and forests that all looked the same. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that those pale eyes were watching me from the shadows, just out of sight. Finally, I ended up in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, the kind of place that's always open, always has someone there, even in the middle of the night. I parked as close to the entrance as I could and ran inside, desperate to be around other people, to feel safe. The diner was nearly empty, just a couple of truckers at the counter and a tired-looking waitress refilling coffee cups. I found a booth in the corner and sat down, my back to the wall, where I could see the door. My hands were still shaking, and my mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The waitress came over, giving me a curious look, but she didn't ask any questions. I ordered a coffee, though I knew I wouldn't be able to drink it. I just needed something to do, something to focus on other than the terror that was gnawing at the edges of my mind. As I sat there, staring into the dark, steaming liquid, I couldn't help but wonder what I had gotten myself into. I should have never gone down those stairs, never touched that Ouija board, but it was too late for that now. The thing from the basement, whatever it was, had followed me home, and now it was only a matter of time before it caught up with me. Just as I was starting to calm down, my phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with a new notification. I hesitated, a sense of dread creeping over me as I reached for it. When I saw what it was, my blood ran cold. It was a text message from an unknown number. The message was short, just 3 words, but they were enough to send a fresh wave of terror through me. "I'm still here." I dropped the phone, my hands trembling so badly that I nearly knocked over the coffee cup. My heart was racing, my mind screaming at me to get out, to leave, to run. But where could I go? No matter where I went, it would find me. It had already proven that. And then, as if to prove my point, I felt it, a cold, unnatural presence, like a breath of icy wind brushing against the back of my neck. I didn't want to turn around, didn't want to see what was standing there, but I had no choice. I slowly lifted my eyes to the reflection in the window, and there it was, the figure, standing just behind me, its pale eyes glowing in the dim light of the diner, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. And then, in that same whispering voice, I heard it say, "Stay with me, forever." Sitting in that diner, with those pale eyes staring at me through the reflection in the window, I felt my world closing in. There's a kind of terror that doesn't just hit you. It settles into your bones, makes you feel like every second might be your last. That's what I felt as I looked at that thing behind me, grinning like it knew something I didn't. For a moment I couldn't move, couldn't think. My brain was screaming at me to get up, to run, but my body wouldn't listen. It was like I was stuck in a nightmare, the kind where your legs turn to lead and you can't escape no matter how hard you try. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the reflection in the window shifted. The figure didn't move, exactly. It just sort of blinked out, like a light switch being flipped off. 1 second it was there, and the next, it was gone, leaving only the ghost of that twisted grin burned into my mind. I whipped around, heart pounding, but the booth behind me was empty. No sign of the figure, no cold breath on my neck, just the quiet hum of the diner and the low murmur of the truckers talking at the counter. I blinked, trying to clear my head, to convince myself it was just another trick, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. I grabbed my phone, my hands still shaking, and stared at the screen. The message was still there, plain as day. I'm still here. But there was something else now. Something that made my blood run even colder. The message had changed. It wasn't just those 3 words anymore. Beneath them, another line had appeared, and I could almost feel the venom behind the words. Look outside. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly turned my gaze toward the window. At first, all I could see was the parking lot, lit by the sickly yellow glow of the streetlights. The asphalt was wet from a recent rain, shimmering like oil in the dim light. Everything looked normal, quiet, still, like nothing had happened. But then, I saw it. At the far end of the lot, just beyond the reach of the nearest streetlight, a shadow moved. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of darkness in the corner of my eye. But as I watched, it began to take shape, growing taller, more defined, until it stood out starkly against the night. It was the figure, the same one from the mirror, the same one that had been watching me since the basement. Only now, it wasn't just a reflection or a fleeting image. It was real, standing there at the edge of the lot, those pale eyes locked onto mine, even from this distance. I should have run, should have grabbed my keys and sped off into the night. But I was frozen, trapped in the gaze of whatever this thing was. And then, as if it could sense my fear, it began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it took a step forward, its long, spindly limbs almost gliding over the ground. The streetlights flickered as it passed, casting long, distorted shadows that twisted and curled like something alive. It was coming for me, and I knew that if I didn't do something, it would catch me, drag me back to whatever hell it had crawled out of. My mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to fight back. And then, out of nowhere, an idea hit me. It was crazy, maybe even suicidal, but it was the only thing I could think of that might work. I bolted out of the booth, nearly knocking over the coffee cup in my haste, and ran to the counter. The waitress and the truckers looked up in surprise as I grabbed the nearest knife from the table. A dull, stainless steel butter knife that probably wouldn't do much damage to anything. But I wasn't planning on using it as a weapon. I had something else in mind. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my trembling hands, and dragged the knife across my palm, wincing as the metal bit into my skin. Blood welled up immediately, dark and slick, dripping onto the floor in thick red drops. The waitress gasped, her eyes wide with shock, but I didn't have time to explain. I turned back toward the window, holding my bleeding hand up to the glass, and pressed it against the cool surface. The blood smeared across the window, leaving a dark crimson stain that seemed to pulse with life. And then I spoke the words that I hoped would give me a fighting chance. I break the bond. You have no power here. My voice was steady, more so than I expected, and the words hung in the air like a challenge. For a moment, nothing happened. The figure kept moving, drawing closer, its eyes locked onto mine with that same hungry intensity. But then, as if in response to my words, it stopped. The figure paused at the edge of the light, its form flickering like a dying candle. I could see it struggling, as if some invisible force was holding it back, preventing it from getting any closer. It was working. The bond between us, whatever it was weakening. I pressed harder against the glass, feeling the sting of the cut in my hand, and repeated the words with more force. I break the bond. You have no power here. This time, the reaction was immediate. The figure let out a sound, a low, guttural growl that I could feel vibrating through the glass. It recoiled, the pale eyes flaring with something that looked almost like pain or anger. The shadows around it twisted and writhed as if the darkness itself was alive, but it couldn't move forward. It was trapped. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a spark of hope. I was fighting back and it was working. But I knew I couldn't stop now. Whatever connection this thing had to me, I had to sever it completely, or it would find a way back. I turned to the waitress, who was staring at me like I'd lost my mind, and asked for salt. Any kind of salt she had. She blinked, confused, but then rushed behind the counter and grabbed a small container, handing it to me with trembling hands. I didn't have time to thank her. I opened the container and poured a line of salt across the windowsill, muttering under my breath the whole time. "Stay out. You're not welcome here. This is my sanctuary." The figure outside recoiled again, hissing as the salt hit the ground. The shadows around it thrashed violently, as if trying to escape some unseen restraint. I could feel the connection between us weakening further, the bond fraying like an old, worn rope. But then, just as I thought I might actually be winning, the figure did something I didn't expect. It smiled. That grin, that same twisted, malevolent grin I'd seen in the mirror, spread across its face, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It was as if the figure knew something I didn't, some secret that it was holding on to, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal. And then, in a voice that echoed inside my skull, it spoke. "You can't escape me. You're already mine." The words slammed into me like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of my lungs. The salt line flickered, the light around it dimming, as if the figure's presence was too powerful to hold back. I staggered back, clutching my bleeding hand, feeling the hope I'd built up start to crumble. The figure began to move again, slowly, methodically, as if it had all the time in the world. The streetlights flickered out as it passed, one by one, plunging the parking lot into darkness. It was getting closer, the connection between us growing stronger with each step. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't give up. I couldn't let this thing win. I reached deep inside myself, grasping for anything that might help, anything that could break its hold on me. And then I remembered something that might just turn the tide. I dug into my pocket, pulling out the small, worn crucifix I always carried with me. It wasn't much, just a simple metal cross on a chain, but it was something, a symbol of protection, of faith. I held it up to the window, the cold metal pressing against my palm, and whispered a desperate prayer. "Leave me, I reject you, you have no place here." The figure paused again, its grin faltering for the briefest moment. The air around me seemed to shift, the oppressive weight lifting slightly, and I could feel the bond between us weakening once more. The darkness around the figure thinned, like smoke dissipating in the wind, but it wasn't enough. The figure let out another growl, this one more furious, more desperate, and lunged forward, slamming against the invisible barrier that the salt and the crucifix had created. The windows rattled, the glass cracking under the force of its assault, but it couldn't break through. Not yet. I pressed the crucifix harder against the window, focusing all my willpower on pushing the figure back, on severing the bond completely. My hand burned from the pressure, my head pounding with the effort, but I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. And then, just as I thought I couldn't hold out any longer, the figure began to fade. The pale eyes dimmed, the twisted grin slackening as the darkness around it dissolved. It let out one final, anguished wail, the sound reverberating through the night, before it vanished completely, leaving nothing behind but the shattered remains of the bond that had tied us together. I collapsed into the booth, my body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The diner was quiet again, the light steady, the air no longer heavy with dread. The waitress and the truckers were staring at me like I'd just walked out of a war zone. But I didn't care. I was safe, at least for now. But even as I sat there, trying to catch my breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The figure might be gone, but its words echoed in my mind, a chilling reminder that it wasn't done with me yet. "You're already mine." I didn't go home that night. How could I, after what I'd just faced? The thought of returning to my house, of being alone with whatever darkness still lingered, was unbearable. Instead, I drove aimlessly for hours, the city lights blurring together as I tried to make sense of everything that had happened. But no matter how far I drove, no matter how many turns I took, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, followed. By the time the sun started to rise, casting the sky in a dull grey light, I found myself back at the edge of the woods, the same woods where this all began. It felt like the last place on earth I should be, but something drew me there, a pull I couldn't resist. Maybe it was that last message, the one that had haunted me since the diner. You're already mine. I parked the car on the shoulder, staring into the trees, half expecting to see the figure standing there, waiting for me. But there was nothing, just the silent, still woods, bathed in the early morning light. The place looked so normal, so deceptively peaceful, that I almost convinced myself it had all been a nightmare, some twisted hallucination brought on by stress and fear. But I knew better. Whatever this thing was, whatever had followed me home, it wasn't just going to let me go, not without a fight. I got out of the car, the morning air cold against my skin, and headed into the woods. My feet crunched on the fallen leaves, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet. With every step, the tension in my chest tightened, a cold dread settling over me like a heavy blanket. I didn't want to go back there, didn't want to face whatever was waiting in that basement, but I knew I had to. This was the only way to end it. The hidden staircase was exactly where I remembered it, half buried in the undergrowth, just as ominous as before. The door at the bottom was still open, hanging ajar, as if it had been waiting for me to return. I stood at the top of the stairs for a long moment, staring down into the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to get as far away from this place as possible. But I forced myself to move forward. The descent felt longer this time, each step echoing off the stone walls, the air growing colder with every footfall. By the time I reached the bottom, my breath was coming in shallow gasps, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. The room was just as I'd left it, the Ouija board still sitting on the table, the dirt floor undisturbed. But there was something different about the air, something heavy and oppressive, like the space itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The memory of that severed head flashed through my mind, and I had to fight the urge to turn and run. I took a step forward, the floor crunching under my boots, and the shadows seemed to shift, coiling around me like they were alive. I reached the table, staring down at the Ouija board, the letters and numbers barely visible beneath the grime. My hands shook as I touched it, feeling the rough wood under my fingertips, the air around me growing colder still. I didn't want to use it. I didn't want to ask any more questions, to invite whatever was down here to show itself again. But I knew I didn't have a choice. If I wanted this to end, I had to confront it. I had to know what it wanted from me. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and placed my hands on the board. The wood felt unnaturally cold, like it was draining the warmth from my body. But I didn't pull away. Instead, I whispered the question that had been burning in my mind since this all began. What do you want from me? For a moment, nothing happened. The room was deathly silent, the shadows around me thick and heavy. But then, slowly, the planchette began to move. My heart skipped a beat as it slid across the board, spelling out a single word. S-O-U-L. The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and I felt a cold dread settle over me. I had expected something like this, some kind of malevolent force demanding a price. But seeing it spelled out in front of me made it all too real. My stomach turned as I realized what it meant, that the thing from the basement had claimed me, that it had marked me as its own. But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Why? I whispered, my voice trembling. Why me? The planchette moved again, faster this time, the letters blurring as it spelled out its answer. Y-O-U-O-P-E-N-E-D-T-H-E-D-O-O-R. My blood ran cold as the meaning of those words sank in. It wasn't just the physical door I had opened. That had been the catalyst, sure. But the real door, the one that had sealed my fate, had been opened long before. The door in my mind, the one that had been cracked open by my own curiosity, by my decision to descend those stairs and touch that board. I had invited this thing into my life, and now it wasn't going to leave until it had taken what it wanted. I backed away from the table, the weight of the realization pressing down on me. There was no running from this, no hiding. Whatever bond I had formed with this thing, it was too strong to break. It had claimed me, and there was only one way to sever the connection. I had to go deeper. I had to face it head on, confront whatever was lurking in the darkness, and end this once and for all. With shaking hands, I reached for the board, ready to ask the final question. But before I could touch it, the shadows around me began to shift. The air grew colder, the darkness pressing in from all sides, and I felt a presence, stronger, more malevolent than before, closing in on me. And then, from the far corner of the room, I heard it. A soft, shuffling sound, like something heavy being dragged across the dirt floor. My breath caught in my throat as I turned, my eyes straining to see in the dim light. The darkness was thick, almost tangible, and at first I couldn't make out what was there. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw it. Something moving in the shadows, crawling toward me. It was the figure, but this time it was different. The pale eyes were gone, replaced by empty hollow sockets that seemed to suck in the light. The body was twisted and deformed, the limbs bent at unnatural angles, like a puppet with its strings cut. It crawled toward me on all fours, its movements jerky and unnatural, the sound of its approach sending chills down my spine. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest, but the figure kept coming, dragging itself across the floor with an unnatural strength. And then, as it drew closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The face, what was left of it, was mine. I stumbled back, my mind reeling, as the figure lifted its head, its empty eye sockets locking onto mine. It grinned, that same twisted, malevolent grin I had seen before, only now it was worse, because it was my own face twisted into that horrible expression. "You're already mine," it whispered, its voice a grotesque mockery of my own. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to get away from that thing, but I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the spot, my body frozen in place. The figure reached out, its twisted, broken fingers brushing against my leg, and I felt a cold, searing pain shoot through my body. And then, just as suddenly, the pain was gone. The figure recoiled, hissing as if it had been burned, and I felt a surge of power, of defiance rising up inside me. I wasn't going to let this thing take me, not without a fight. I reached into my pocket, pulling out the crucifix, and held it out in front of me. The figure hissed again, retreating into the shadows, but I didn't stop. I stepped forward, forcing it back, the air crackling with tension as I pressed the crucifix against its chest. "Leave me!" I shouted, my voice ringing out in the darkness. "You have no power here. I reject you." The figure let out a screech, a sound that cut through me like a knife, but I didn't falter. I pressed harder, feeling the crucifix grow warm in my hand, and with one final agonized wail, the figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving nothing but the echo of its scream behind. The room was silent again, the darkness lifting, the air returning to its normal, cool stillness. I dropped to my knees, gasping for breath, the crucifix still clutched in my hand. It was over. The bond was broken. But as I knelt there, trembling with exhaustion, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The air felt lighter, yes, but there was still a lingering presence, a shadow that clung to the edges of my mind. And then I understood. The figure might be gone, the immediate threat might be over, but the darkness it had brought with it wasn't. It had left a mark, a stain on my soul that I couldn't wash away. No matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, I would always carry a piece of that basement with me. And as I stood up, the final realization hit me. Cold and hard. I hadn't escaped. Not really. I had severed the bond, but the figure's words still echoed in my mind, a chilling reminder that I could never truly be free. "You're already mine." This is where the story ends, for now. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I do know one thing. I'll never be the same. The darkness is still with me, lurking in the shadows of my mind, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And when it does, I'll be ready. At least, I hope I will. I called my dead parents with the Ouija board. The next night, someone rang on my door. I never believed in the paranormal. To be honest, I always thought it was just a bunch of nonsense. Ghosts, spirits, and all that. Just stories people tell to scare themselves. But after what happened to me last week, I'm not sure what to believe anymore. It all started with a stupid Ouija board. I found it while cleaning out my parents' old house. They passed away a few years ago in a car accident, and it's taken me this long to finally go through their things. It was tough, you know, sorting through old photo albums, their clothes, the little trinkets they kept everywhere. It just felt like they were still there, somehow. The board was buried deep in a dusty box in the attic, sandwiched between some old magazines and a couple of those awful holiday sweaters my mum used to make us wear. I don't remember them ever using a Ouija board, and I certainly never saw it before. It was a cheap cardboard thing, not one of those fancy wooden ones. The planchette was still there too, with a small crack on one side. I'm not sure what possessed me to keep it. Maybe it was the morbid curiosity that comes from spending too much time alone. Or maybe it was just the weight of being surrounded by so many memories. Either way, I took it back to my apartment and tossed it in the corner of my living room, not really thinking much about it. The next few days were rough. I kept thinking about my parents, replaying our last conversations in my head, wondering if they knew how much I loved them. It's funny how grief works, how it sneaks up on you when you least expect it. I started having trouble sleeping, waking up in the middle of the night with this overwhelming sense of loneliness, the kind that makes your chest feel heavy, like there's a weight on it. One night, after another few hours of staring at the ceiling, I decided to try something stupid. I pulled out the Ouija board. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I thought maybe, just maybe, I could talk to them one last time, get some closure, you know? I set it up on my coffee table, lit a few candles for atmosphere. Yeah, I was that guy. And sat down in front of it. I didn't really know what I was doing. I'd seen enough movies to get the gist though. I placed my fingers lightly on the planchette and asked, "Mum, Dad, are you there?" Nothing happened, of course. I wasn't expecting it to. But then, I felt this. I don't know how to describe it. It was like a cold breeze, except I was inside and all the windows were closed. The planchette twitched slightly under my fingers and I almost jumped out of my skin. But it didn't move any further, so I figured it was just my imagination. I tried again. "Mum, Dad, can you hear me?" This time, the planchette moved. It was slow, almost hesitant, like it was being pushed by a weak hand. It slid over to yes. My heart started pounding in my chest. I couldn't believe it. There had to be some logical explanation. Maybe I was unconsciously moving it myself, or maybe it was just a trick of the mind. I kept going, asking the usual questions. "Are you okay? Do you miss me?" The planchette moved to yes every time. My eyes were tearing up by this point. It was stupid, I knew, but it felt like they were really there with me, even if it was just some psychological trick. Then I asked, "Is there anything you want to tell me?" The planchette hesitated, then slowly moved to no. I sat there, staring at the board, feeling a strange mix of relief and disappointment. I was about to close the session when something strange happened. The planchette started moving on its own, faster than before. It spelled out, "Don't trust." I blinked, trying to process what I was seeing. "Don't trust who?" I asked, my voice trembling. The planchette didn't move. I waited, my heart racing, but nothing happened. After a few minutes, I gave up and ended the session, saying goodbye to whatever I had been talking to. I put the board away and tried to convince myself that it was all just a weird coincidence. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, or maybe I was just too tired to think straight. But the whole thing left me feeling uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, like I had opened a door I wasn't supposed to. I barely slept that night, tossing and turning, my mind racing with what-ifs and maybes. The next day, I decided to forget about it. I mean, it was just a stupid game, right? But as the sun started to set, I couldn't help but feel this growing sense of dread. It was like there was something lurking in the shadows, just out of sight. Something that was waiting for me. Then, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a news alert. A man in our town had been found dead in his home, his face twisted into a look of pure terror. The article didn't give many details, just that the police were investigating it as a possible homicide. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was just a freak accident, I told myself. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow connected to what I had done. That maybe, just maybe, I had made a terrible mistake. And that's when the doorbell rang. The doorbell ringing in the dead of night is something you don't forget easily. It wasn't just a quick press of the button either. It was a long, drawn-out ring, like whoever was outside was holding it down on purpose. It sent chills down my spine, especially since it was nearly midnight. Who would be at my door at this hour? I hesitated for a moment, just listening. My apartment was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I waited, half expecting the doorbell to ring again, but it didn't. Just that one prolonged ring. I grabbed my phone and glanced at the screen. No new messages, no missed calls. The uneasy feeling from earlier was back, stronger than before. I crept towards the door, my footsteps almost silent on the carpeted floor. I felt like a kid sneaking around after bedtime, except there was no comfort in the darkness tonight. When I reached the door, I hesitated again. There's something inherently terrifying about looking through the peephole late at night. It feels like you're inviting whatever's on the other side to peer right back at you, but I had to know who was there. Slowly, I leaned forward and pressed my eye against the peephole. The hallway outside was empty. My breath caught in my throat. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, just staring out into the empty corridor, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. The light outside my door flickered once, twice, and then steadied. That was enough to get my heart racing even more, but I still couldn't see anyone. I stepped back from the door, my mind racing. Maybe it was just some kid playing a prank, or maybe someone had the wrong apartment. That seemed logical enough, but it didn't explain the sick feeling in my stomach. It didn't explain why I felt like something was watching me even now. I debated whether I should open the door, but every instinct told me not to. Instead, I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the couch, something I'd never actually had to use, and sat down in the living room, trying to calm my nerves. The silence in the apartment was almost suffocating, so I turned on the TV for some background noise, something mindless, like an old sitcom, to drown out the unease. But I couldn't focus on it. My eyes kept darting to the front door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. I knew I wouldn't sleep that night. The minutes dragged on, and the knot in my stomach grew tighter. The uneasy feeling I'd had all day was now a full-blown panic. Something was wrong. I could feel it. Around 3 a.m., just as I was beginning to think I'd imagined the whole thing, my phone buzzed on the coffee table, startling me so badly I nearly dropped the bat. I snatched it up, my heart pounding. The screen lit up with a message from an unknown number. "Did you open it?" I stared at the message, my blood running cold. Open what? The door. The board. I didn't know what they meant, but I knew it wasn't good. My fingers trembled as I typed back. "Who is this?" The reply was almost immediate. "You know who." I didn't, or at least I didn't want to. My thoughts were a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. I hadn't given my number out to anyone recently, and certainly not to anyone who would send a message like this. The rational part of me was trying to find an explanation. Maybe it was some kind of sick joke or a scam. But deep down, I knew it was connected to the Ouija board, to whatever I had reached out to the night before. Before I could think of a response, another message came through. "We're outside." That's when the knocking started. It was slow and deliberate, like someone tapping their knuckles lightly against the wood. Not the kind of frantic knocking you'd expect from someone who needed help or was in a hurry. No, this was measured, patient. Whoever, or whatever, was on the other side of that door wasn't in any rush. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts at once. Call the police? Run? But my legs felt like lead. and my hands were trembling too much to dial a number. I couldn't move, couldn't think straight. The only thing I could do was stare at the door, at the source of the soft, persistent knocking that seemed to echo through the entire apartment. After what felt like hours, the knocking stopped. Silence filled the room again. But this time, it was different. It was a suffocating, oppressive silence, like the air was thick with something I couldn't see. My phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. "Don't make us wait!" My heart was hammering in my chest so loudly I was sure they could hear it outside. I didn't know what to do. Every part of me screamed to stay put, to not open that door, but something was pulling me toward it, like a moth to a flame, or maybe a lamb to the slaughter. I stood up, my legs shaking beneath me, and took a step toward the door. The TV in the background was just static now, but I didn't even notice when it had changed. My focus was entirely on the door, on whatever was waiting for me on the other side. I didn't have to look through the peephole to know they were still out there. I could feel it. This oppressive, malevolent presence just waiting for me to make a move, to do something stupid, and I was about to. With trembling hands, I reached for the door handle, but just as my fingers brushed against the cold metal, the doorbell rang again, long and drawn out, just like before. But this time, I knew it wasn't someone ringing it. It was like the sound itself was alive, mocking me, daring me to open the door. I froze, my hand hovering over the handle, and unable to decide whether to turn it or run. The air around me felt thick and heavy, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. And then, just as I was about to pull my hand away, I heard it. A whisper. Faint, barely audible, but clear enough to send a shiver down my spine. It came from right behind me. "Don't open it." My blood ran cold as the whisper faded into the darkness behind me. I could still feel the icy breath on the back of my neck, like someone had been standing right there, just inches away. I spun around, bat raised, but the room was empty, just the faint, flickering light from the TV casting shadows on the walls. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it, that heavy presence lingering in the room with me. It was like the air had changed, thickened with something I couldn't see or hear, but I knew it was there. My skin prickled with fear as I stood frozen in place, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound, afraid of what might happen if I did. The doorbell had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. The static from the TV seemed to grow louder, filling the room with a low, droning hum that vibrated in my chest. The whisper echoed in my mind, over and over. "Don't open it." I wanted to run, to get as far away from that door as possible, but my legs refused to move. Something was holding me there, some invisible force that kept me rooted to the spot. It wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, something primal. Like my body knew that leaving the room would be a mistake, that opening that door would be the worst decision I could make. But I couldn't just stand there forever. I had to do something. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what was happening, how I'd ended up in this nightmare. The Ouija board, the messages, the knocking, none of it made any sense, but it all felt connected, like I'd started something I couldn't stop. My phone buzzed in my hand again, the screen lighting up with another message. My heart skipped a beat as I read it. "Turn around." I couldn't help it. My body reacted before my brain could catch up, and I whipped around, eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. But there was nothing, just the same empty space, the same creeping shadows. I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself, but my hands were trembling so badly I could barely keep hold of the bat. Another buzz. This time, the message was different. "Let us in." The room felt like it was closing in on me. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to hide, to do anything but stay where I was. But there was nowhere to go. My apartment wasn't big, and the only exit was the front door, the same door I was too terrified to approach. And then I heard it again. The whisper. "Don't let them in." It was closer this time, almost like it was right next to my ear. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up, a chill running down my spine. I was trapped between the door and whatever was inside the apartment with me, and I had no idea which was worse. I knew I couldn't stay in that room much longer. The air was getting heavier, thicker, like it was pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I needed to get out, but I didn't know how. My eyes darted to the door, then back to the shadows in the room, my mind racing for a solution. And then, like a flash of clarity, I remembered something. The Ouija board. It was still in my living room, tucked away in a corner where I'd left it after that first night. I didn't know what good it would do, but it felt like my only option. Maybe if I could figure out what I had done, I could reverse it, stop whatever I'd let loose. I forced myself to move, my legs stiff and uncooperative as I shuffled toward the living room. Every step felt like I was walking through molasses, slow and laboured. The static from the TV grew louder as I got closer, until it was almost deafening, buzzing in my ears like a swarm of angry bees. When I reached the living room, I found the Ouija board exactly where I'd left it, leaning against the wall, half hidden in shadow. It looked so ordinary, so mundane, like a harmless toy you'd find in a kid's closet. But I knew better now. There was nothing harmless about it. I grabbed the board and the planchette, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do. Was I supposed to use it again? Close whatever door I had opened? Or was that exactly what they wanted me to do? My thoughts were interrupted by another buzz from my phone. The message this time was short, but it sent a jolt of fear straight through me. "It's too late!" The words stared back at me from the screen. A cruel taunt, a final warning. My heart sank as I realized the truth. Whatever I had done, whatever I had let in, it was already here. In the room with me, watching, waiting. I dropped the phone, the clatter of it hitting the floor barely registering over the roaring in my ears. I couldn't think straight, couldn't focus on anything except the overwhelming sense of dread that had taken hold of me. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow, darker than the others, shifting in the corner of the room. It was subtle at first, like a trick of the light, but as I stared, it began to take shape. A tall, thin figure, almost human but not quite, its limbs too long, its movements too fluid. It stepped forward, out of the shadows, and I could feel its gaze on me, cold and piercing. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place, my body betraying me as the figure moved closer. The air around me grew colder, the oppressive weight of its presence pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. And then it spoke, in a voice that wasn't a whisper anymore, but a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the room. "You shouldn't have called us." The figure was right in front of me now, its face, if you could call it that, just inches from mine. It was a void, an absence of light, of life, of anything human. I could feel its cold breath on my skin, could hear the faintest sound of something clicking, like claws tapping together in the darkness. I wanted to close my eyes, to shut it all out, but I couldn't look away. I was trapped, paralyzed by fear, by the realization that I had done this to myself, that whatever happened next was my fault. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the figure reaching out, its hand, or whatever it was, brushing against my cheek, and that cold, hollow voice echoing in my mind, sealing my fate. "Now you're one of us." When I woke up, I wasn't in my apartment anymore. At first, I thought I was dreaming. The world around me was dark, so dark that I couldn't tell where I ended and the shadows began. The air was thick and cold, making it hard to breathe, like the atmosphere itself was pressing down on me. There was no sound, no light, nothing but the overwhelming blackness that seemed to stretch on forever. I tried to move, but my limbs felt heavy, like they were made of lead. My thoughts were sluggish, hazy, like I was wading through thick fog. Panic began to creep in, and I forced myself to focus, to try and make sense of what was happening. But the more I tried to remember, the more it felt like I was sinking deeper into the void. Then, Slowly, shapes began to emerge from the darkness. At first, they were just vague outlines, shadowy figures that moved in and out of the periphery of my vision. But as I strained to see, they became clearer. Tall, twisted forms that seemed to hover just out of reach, circling me like predators. Their eyes, if they had eyes, glowed faintly in the dark. 2 pinpricks of light that seemed to pierce through the blackness and straight into my soul. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, my voice gone. The fear that had gripped me earlier was back, but now it was deeper, more profound. This wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was a primal terror, the kind that lives deep in your bones, in the part of you that knows when you're facing something you can't fight, can't escape. I tried to stand, to push myself up from whatever surface I was lying on, but my body wouldn't cooperate. My muscles felt weak, drained of all energy, like I'd been lying there for days. The figures in the darkness didn't move closer, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting, and then, out of the silence, came the voice, "Welcome." It wasn't like the whisper or the growl I'd heard before. This voice was different, calm, smooth, almost soothing, but with an edge that sent chills down my spine. It echoed through the void, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I couldn't tell if it was inside my head or if the darkness itself was speaking to me. "Where am I?" I croaked, barely recognizing my own voice. "You're with us now," the voice replied, the tone almost pleased. "Who are you?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. The figures in the shadows seemed to shift as if they were laughing, but no sound came out. The voice spoke again, its tone dripping with something that might have been amusement. "We are what you called, what you invited. You opened the door, and now it cannot be closed." My mind raced, trying to piece together what it meant. The Ouija board, the messages, the knocking, all of it had led to this moment, but I still didn't understand. I was in over my head, and whatever these things were, they had the upper hand. "I didn't mean to," I started, but the voice cut me off, sharper now, more sinister. "Intentions are meaningless here. You sought to speak with the dead, and now you're with them. But this place is not for the living." A cold dread settled over me as the realization hit. I had called out to my parents, hoping for closure, for some kind of peace, but instead I had brought something else into my life, something dark, something that didn't belong in our world. And now I was trapped here, wherever here was, with no way out. The shadows shifted again, and I could feel the presence of the figures closing in, the air growing colder, thicker. I tried to move, to crawl away, but I was too weak, too drained. The voice spoke once more, a final warning. "You cannot leave, not until we are done with you." The weight of those words crushed what little hope I had left. I was at their mercy, and whatever they wanted from me, I had no choice but to give. I could feel the darkness closing in, pressing against my skin, seeping into my mind, filling every corner of my consciousness with despair. And then, just when I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, something changed. The darkness around me began to shift, the figures retreating, the weight lifting from my chest. I could breathe again, but the air was still cold, still thick with the presence of whatever had brought me here. The voice was gone, but I could still feel it, lingering just out of reach, waiting. My vision cleared slightly, and I realized I was standing, or rather floating, in a vast, empty space. The ground beneath me was solid, but it felt wrong, like it was pulsing with some unseen energy. Ahead of me, something began to take shape, a doorway, just like the one in my apartment, but distorted, twisted, as if it had been stretched and warped by the darkness around it. It was a door, but not like any door I had ever seen. The frame was made of something black and glistening, like oil, and the surface of the door seemed to ripple as if it were alive. And then, with a low creak that echoed through the void, the door began to open. The light that spilled out was blinding, too bright for my eyes after so long in the dark. I raised a hand to shield my face, squinting against the glare. But as my vision adjusted, I could see that the light wasn't coming from inside the door. It was coming from beyond it, from the world I had left behind. A surge of hope filled my chest. Maybe this was it, my way out. Maybe I could escape, leave this nightmare behind. I stepped forward, the figures in the shadows retreating further as I approached the door. The closer I got, the stronger the light became, until it was almost unbearable. But just as I reached the threshold, just as I was about to step through, I heard it, the whisper, the same one that had warned me before, now filled with urgency, with a desperation that sent a jolt of fear through my heart. "Don't go through the door." I froze, my foot hovering just inches from the threshold. I wanted to ignore the whisper, to leave this place behind. But something in the voice made me hesitate. It wasn't just fear that held me back. It was something else, something deeper. A feeling that if I stepped through that door, I would be walking into something far worse than what I had already experienced. The light from the door was warm, inviting, but it was a false warmth, a lie. I could feel it now. A sickening sensation in the pit of my stomach. The figures in the shadows were gone, but the darkness remained, pressing in on me from all sides, urging me to make a decision. I didn't know what to do. I was caught between two horrors, one unknown and the other all too familiar. But deep down, I knew the truth. The door wasn't an escape. It was a trap, a final test. And the whisper was the only thing keeping me from stepping into it. With every ounce of strength I had left, I turned away from the door. The light behind me dimmed, and the darkness closed in once more. But this time, it wasn't as oppressive, wasn't as suffocating. The figures in the shadows didn't return, and the voice, that sinister, smooth voice, was silent. I had made my choice, but I didn't know what it meant. The door had closed behind me, and I was alone again in the dark. But something was different now. I could feel a presence with me. Not the same malevolent force as before, but something else. Something familiar. Something almost comforting. The whisper returned, softer now, almost like a sigh of relief. "You did well." I didn't respond, didn't know how to. My mind was still reeling, my body still trembling from the fear and exhaustion. But the darkness around me began to lift, the void slowly giving way to something else, something new. And as the world began to reshape itself around me, I realized that whatever happened next, I wasn't alone anymore. When the darkness finally lifted, I found myself standing in a place that was eerily familiar, yet wrong in ways I couldn't quite explain. I was back in my apartment, or at least it looked like my apartment. The same layout, the same furniture, the same photographs on the wall, but everything was off, like a twisted reflection in a funhouse mirror. The colours were muted, washed out, and the air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and something metallic, like blood. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, darker, and they moved when I wasn't looking directly at them. It felt like the apartment was alive, watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I took a step forward, and the floorboards creaked under my weight, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness. My heart was pounding in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to get out, to run as far as I could. But I knew there was no running from this, no escaping what I had started. The whisper was gone, and with it, the small comfort it had brought. I was truly alone now, left to face whatever awaited me in this twisted version of my home. As I moved deeper into the apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being led, guided towards something I wasn't sure I wanted to find. The living room was empty, the TV off, the Ouija board still lying on the floor where I had dropped it. But there was something different about it now. A thin layer of dust had settled over it, as if it had been sitting there for years, forgotten and abandoned. I avoided looking at it too closely, afraid of what I might see. I continued into the hallway, each step heavier than the last, the dread building inside me like a knot tightening in my gut. The shadows seemed to grow thicker as I approached the door to my bedroom, a door that was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness seeping out from the gap. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, the cold metal sending a shiver down my spine. I hesitated, my breath hitching in my throat. But I knew I had to see what was inside. Whatever this was, whatever had brought me here, it was waiting for me on the other side. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The room beyond was pitch black, an impenetrable void that swallowed up the weak light from the hallway. I strained my eyes, trying to see into the darkness, but there was nothing, just a vast emptiness that seemed to stretch on forever. And then, out of the silence, I heard it again, the whisper. But this time, it wasn't a warning, it was a name. Daniel! I froze, my heart skipping a beat. That was my name. No one else should have known that. Not here, not in this place. The sound of it, spoken in that soft, familiar voice, sent a chill through me, a wave of emotions I couldn't control. I wanted to run, to get out of that room, but my feet were rooted to the spot. Daniel, the voice repeated, a little louder this time, more insistent. Come in. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move, to take a step into the darkness. The air was thick and cold, clinging to my skin like a damp shroud. As I ventured further into the room, the door behind me creaked shut, plunging me into total darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. I could hear my own breathing, harsh and uneven, the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. And then, slowly, a shape began to emerge from the darkness in front of me. It was a figure, tall and thin, shrouded in shadows. I couldn't make out any features, just the outline of a person standing there, watching me. The presence was overwhelming, suffocating, and I could feel the weight of its gaze on me, boring into my soul. Daniel, the voice said again, but now it was different. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a chorus of voices, all speaking in unison, their tones blending together in a cacophony of sound that made my skin crawl. What do you want? I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. It just stood there, its form shifting slightly in the darkness, as if it were made of smoke. The voices continued to speak, overlapping, intertwining, creating a symphony of sound that filled the room, filled my mind. You called us, they said, the words echoing in my head, bouncing off the walls of my skull. You brought us here, and now you must listen. I didn't understand, didn't want to understand, but there was no escaping it now. The voices grew louder, more insistent, and the figure began to move, slowly, deliberately, closing the distance between us. With each step it took, the room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, the shadows growing thicker, darker. The air grew colder, biting at my skin, and the smell of earth and blood intensified, filling my nostrils, making me gag. The figure stopped just inches from me, and for the first time, I could see its eyes. Two burning embers in the darkness, glowing with an unnatural light. They bored into me, searching, probing, and I could feel them digging into my mind, into my memories, unearthing everything I had tried to bury. You wanted to speak with the dead, the voices said, merging into one, a deep, guttural growl that resonated in my bones. And now, you will. Before I could react, the figure lunged at me, its hands, cold, skeletal hands, grabbing my shoulders, pulling me into the darkness. The world around me spun, twisted, and I was falling, spiraling down into an abyss of blackness and cold. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. I was no longer in the room, no longer in my apartment. I was somewhere else, somewhere far away, somewhere I couldn't escape. I was standing in a cemetery, the moon hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows across the graves. The air was cold, the ground beneath my feet damp and soft. In front of me, two headstones stood side by side, their surfaces worn and weathered by time. I knew those graves. I had visited them so many times before, had stood in that exact spot and wept for the loss of the people buried there. My parents. I fell to my knees, the cold earth seeping into my clothes, and stared at the headstones. The names carved into the stone blurring as tears filled my eyes. I didn't understand what was happening, didn't know why I was here, but the weight of my grief, my guilt, crushed me. pressing me down into the ground. The whisper returned, softer now, almost gentle. You wanted to speak with them. Now listen. The ground beneath the graves began to shift, the earth churning and breaking apart. I watched, horrified, as two skeletal hands emerged from the soil, clawing their way to the surface. The figures that followed were barely recognizable, their bodies decayed, their faces twisted and hollow, but I knew who they were. My parents stood before me, their empty eyes staring into mine, their mouths opening and closing, trying to speak, but no sound came out. I wanted to reach out to them, to hold them, to tell them I was sorry, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, and I realized that it wasn't just one voice. It was many, all blending together into a chorus of pain, of anger, of loss. You called us, they said, the words echoing through the cemetery, through my mind. And now you are with us. The ground beneath me gave way, and I was falling again, falling into the earth, into the grave that had been waiting for me all along. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was my parents' faces, their empty eyes watching as I was pulled down, down into the cold, unforgiving ground. And then there was nothing. No light, no sound, no pain, just darkness and the whisper